Hello, you are on the Simplelook channel. Pretty soon we will see what we have been waiting for 3 years, namely the continuation of the Game of Thrones universe, and even if technically it is certainly not a sequel, but on the contrary a prequel. I think you understood what I meant. The Game of Thrones universe, call it what you want. Well, it's not surprising that the prequel format was chosen by HBO as the safest. The whole world was just stunned by the news that the big bosses decided to take an unprecedented step. It seems like to remove the sequel of Thrones and Jon Snow, to show what happened to him after the Season 8 finale, and thus go even further into uncharted territory not regulated by Martin's books in any way. And in fact to shoot Season 9. What is true here, what is not, what we should wait for, and whether HBO has gone crazy risking total failure. Well, first let's talk in general terms about what we know and what we are discussing here. Last week, information leaked to the network that HBO is already developing another spin-off of the Game of Thrones series, this time focusing on Jon Snow. If you suddenly forgot what happened to Jon Snow trying to erase the last season of Thrones from your memory, then I remind you that our King of the North went into exile after the murder of Daenerys, and he will now live out the rest of his days behind the wall, where there no longer seem to be any White Walkers and any undead. So a very reputable publication, The Hollywood Reporter, stunned everyone with the news that now supposedly Kit Harington will play his fan-favorite role in the first potential sequel of Thrones, the actions of which will take place after the events of the original series. A little for quoting the article itself to you. As it became known to The Hollywood Reporter, the network and HBO have started developing their first sequel to Game of Thrones, a spin-off series dedicated to the fan-favorite character Jon Snow. Kit Harington will play this role if the series goes ahead. Perhaps the most daring from a creative point of view would be that the project would turn over the final season of Thrones, as the last words about the fate of the surviving characters of the most popular HBO series of all time, award-winning. The theoretical project may open the door for the appearance of other surviving characters from the universe of Thrones, such as Arya Adarc, Sansa and Brienne of Tarth. This development news means that there are currently 7 Thrones projects in development in addition to the upcoming Dragon House prequel series that debuted. And then a lot of things were said, many parallels were drawn with well-known franchises like Star Wars or Marvel. At the very end, another small addition was made, saying that in the meantime, representatives of HBO or Kit Harington have not yet given their comments. By the way, you know, a very interesting point, because we all perfectly understand what Slovaks are worth. I think no one needs to be reminded how he lied to everyone, no redder. That he will no longer appear in the 6th season of Thrones, that his character died and so on and so forth, for which, by the way, he apologized later. But HBO, oddly enough, has already managed to comment on this news, and they did it quite wittily, albeit ambiguously. HBO Twitter accounts shared a photo of a young Jon Snow along with the already legendary phrase, "I don't know anything." Thus, on the one hand, the company spurs discussion without hurrying to deny anything, or to say that all this is fiction. We do not remove anything like that. On the other hand, the cunning ones do not confirm anything, leaving us as viewers in their thoughts. 2 words about Kitty Harington. Well, the fact that this guy should not be trusted is something we have already discussed, but still, what did he ever say about the prospects of returning to the role of Jon Snow? On this score, we can now recall the comments that Kit made in an interview with the BBC back in 2018. When asked about a hypothetical return to Game of Thrones one day, he replied, "I wish I could go back and do more, but not in this life." So yes, on the one hand, Keith kind of made it clear that he would never come back, but on the other hand, you and I understand that this guy is still a liar. So his no can very simply mean yes. In general, the decision of HBO itself, if it reaches its implementation, is of course such a risk that it is difficult to even imagine. After all, to return to the topic of Jon Snow and his future is to return to the 8th season again to start worrying and chewing all that mediocrity that showrunners fed the audience. It is not surprising that the network has already burst in half from such news, both in terms of the excitement caused and in terms of how people perceived this news. A fan of Game of Thrones disagreed about the sequel to Jon Snow. The most obvious reaction at the moment is shock and bewilderment, and many viewers are wondering, how long did HBO think to guess up to such a brilliant solution? Besides, did Martini say that after A Song of Ice and Fire, he would no longer write sequels? Plus, by all accounts, a separate sequel to Johnny Again is essentially Season 9 of Game of Thrones. After all, who else but he was the main character, but maybe he can still be on a par with Daenerys from over the last seasons of the series. And here, by the way, oddly enough, the main answer may be hidden, which by the way, many people on the web also started talking about. That in this way, perhaps HBO is just trying to rewrite the terrible ending of its cult series, and so to speak get revenge. In the end, rumors that some bosses are still dreaming of the continuation of the Game of Thrones did not appear yesterday. So at least we can finally get the correct resolution of Jon's storylines from the main series, and indeed not only him alone. So while one part of the fandom says that the big bosses have gone completely crazy, this is what is already dead, as Season 8 of Game of Thrones cannot be resurrected again. Others, on the contrary, are full of hope, and Ozma's ultrasound indicates that by and large, especially if other original characters performed by their favorite actors appear in the series, and this is quite possible by and large, it can be something like a second chance for Game of Thrones, and for everyone's favorite series that at one point so incompetently fucked up by its creators. It's hard to disagree here, but it's also hard to disagree with the fact that the risks in this venture are simply prohibitive. Judge for yourself after all this wave of negativity that the 8th season of Game of Thrones caused. To come back to the same topic again is essentially to put everything on the line and risk absolutely everything. Whether the boss of HBO will go to such a thing and, most importantly, whether the idea with the conditional 9th season of Game of Thrones will justify itself is a huge question that has yet to be answered. But by the way, as they say, appetite comes during meals, so many fans of the Song of Ice and Fire are already demanding. So that you think of a solo album for Arya, yes, she's the worst. After the announcement that HBO is also working on a sequel to Game of Thrones featuring Jon Snow, fans are asking the network to give Arya her own spin-off because who has a better story than Arya the Faceless Killer? Viewers say that of all the Game of Thrones characters who survived the final season, the story of Arya Stark was the only worthy sequel. The character goes on a ship to find what is west of Westeros, although this does not make much sense in the context of the main series. But at least Arya is going somewhere exploring new lands and horizons. Isn't this an exciting story? So you see, people can also get into the taste of who knows. But by the way, the news about the Dream Book genre also conceals another huge danger, or a question if you want. The question is, what exactly will this show be about if Martin still hasn't finished the story? And isn't it the lack of a clear primary source that just ruined the last seasons of Game of Thrones? Quite a sound and reasonable question. Lack of promotion of the outlet of the Winds of Winter. In the book that Game of Thrones fans have been waiting for since the release of Dance with Dragons in 2011. It has also been the subject of heated discussions since the announcement of the series A Jon Snow. In addition, people remembered that Martin himself had never said that he would not think about sequels until he finished the Saga of Ice and Fire, and this as if anyone forgot, in addition to the odious Winds of Winter, another book that is probably worth waiting for another 50 years. So of course there are, as always, much more questions than answers, and yet, of course, what a sin to conceal, people for the most part want the return not only of Jon Snow, but also of their other favorites no matter what. Especially considering the fact that if this series of Joe will not be removed after all. The character will undoubtedly end up south of the Wall at some point, so the return of other Stark siblings such as Queen Sansa or even King Bran is not excluded and quite possible. And such prospects simply take out the brain of many. They are forced to greedily search for any news about the allegedly upcoming sequel, and it will be appropriate to recall here that not only the House of the Dragon that came out, and not only a sequel to Jon Snow is possible, but also a number of other projects on Game of Thrones are currently in development at HBO. For example, HBO's other FOMICH spin being in development at various stages as 10,000 Ships, also known as Not Least with Amanda Segal's showrunners. 9 Journey, also known as The Sea Snake with AM showrunner Bruno Heller. And The Story of Dumka and Aegis Shura Norum by Steve Conrad. There are also 3 other animated prequel projects that were first reported by The Hollywood Reporter, including The Golden Empire, which takes place in a mysterious land. In addition, another Game of Thrones production is in development that will revive iconic characters and follows the origins of Robert's Rebellion, which we first learned about in March. So as you can see, HBO's plans are really colossal and the sequel could be their apotheosis, and time will tell whether it will already become or not.